we're going to talk about container gardens, but there's one thing I'd like to just point out. How do you plant into this sheet mulch bed that we just created? This is different than the raised bed that we were talking about in the first modules. In the first modules, we had a wooden framed raised bed that was permanent, that had weeds in it. It hadn't been grown in 2 years, but it was already ready, in essence. It was a bed that was ready to be weeded and planted into. This is, in essence, your lawn, or something you don't have a garden bed in place, but you would like to get one fast. And so the sheet mulching process is a way to get a garden bed fast. It's not a raised bed, it's in ground. How we're going to transplant into it is in the soil that's below this cardboard. We're actually going to use that structured soil to plant into. How do you do that? Well, if you're going to lay out your plants like we did in the first few modules, you can decide what's going to go where, how much space do they need, and how do you place them? What is your plan? But when it comes down to actually just planting into this, if your cardboard is wet, it should be relatively easy. Use your transplanting shovel to break through that cardboard, or you could use a knife if you wanted to, a box knife or just a pocket knife, and break through the cardboard. Just make a slit, or a hole, in essence, that matches the size of your transplant. We are using a transplanting shovel, and that is going to create, the cardboard is a little thick right there, it is going to create a little bit of a compaction area right where the blade is going into the soil, and so we'll break that up a little bit. But we're just tearing out a piece of the cardboard. That gives a window for some of those plants that were under that cardboard to grow again. They're going to get light. So what we're going to do is pull out this plug of soil, set that to the side for just a moment. We're going to break it up. We're going to break up those slicked walls that we just made with our transplanting shovel, because it's in essence kind of we've made a terracotta pot. We've slicked the sides of the transplanting hole with that shovel. So we want to make sure that the roots are going to be able to move through into the crumb structure on the sides. And so we're just breaking that up a little bit. We again want to make sure that our transplants are being put into the ground at the same depth that they are in their nursery pots. And so this nursery pot is probably 3.5 inches tall. Our hole is pretty similar. I'm going to take, this time, a little handful of compost right in the bottom of that planting hole. My handy dandy inoculant. We'll put some information in the description where you might find some inoculant. We don't really have a very diverse inoculant source locally, but I've got a couple favorites that I really love to recommend to clients, and so I'll suggest that. So now we're getting that transplant rested down in that hole, and then I'm going to take this plug of soil that we dug out of the hole. So there's plenty of room around the base of that plant that is still open. I'm going to break the plant material, the living plant material, away and its roots. I'm going to take some of that soil that was down in the bottom of the hole, I'm going to break it up and put it back down in the bottom of the hole around that transplant. I'm going to tuck that in. The microorganisms that were in the bottom of that hole like to stay in the bottom of that hole. They like a lower light, lower oxygen environment, so I'm going to put those guys back. Same with the middle, put those guys back. And then with the top area, I'm going to take that plant, living plant area, and I'm going to turn that upside down so that those plants are roots up. They're not going to have as easy of a time regrowing. And then I'm going to tuck in the mulch right around this beautiful little jalapeno plant. we'll water them in a minute. So the main topic we're going into for this module is container gardens. We're going to talk about a container that's appropriate for tomato. Tomatoes, we've already talked about, are heavy feeders. And so having a container that's large enough, 5-gallon bucket is large enough to support a tomato. So we're going to turn this into a planting container. We need drainage holes. So I'm going to make those real quick. I'm using a large drill bit just because I don't want to make a million holes. I'd rather just make a few large holes than a bunch of tiny ones. All right, so I made the drainage holes up the side, and you'll see why in just a moment. There are two ways that we can rest this container garden in its final place. If you're in an apartment, it makes sense to use a drip tray, but if you are in a space where you can dig it into the lawn or dig it into the soil, you just want a small amount of disturbance, you can do that with this type of setup as well. All right, and so what I like to do next is I like to get some support for drainage, some rocky material. You can get this from usually any of your local concrete mixing locations. We have a place here in Fairfield called Ideal Concrete. So I'm going to pour this in. That's just gravel. But you could also use Riverstone. Do know that the parent material, this is a limestone, so it's got a lot of calcium carbonate in it. It's going to be all right for the tomatoes. They're not really going to get access to much of that calcium just because it's not going to break down very quickly, but over the years it'll start to contribute to the plant fertility over time. But for this season, we're not really sweating that. But you could also, again, use that Riverstone material, which has a diversity of different types of pebbles, which will have a diversity of different types of minerals in it. It's kind of fun to think about it that way. I put it in there just to help water flow. It acts kind of like a retention filter to keep the soil from going out of the drain holes. But also, it gives a place where the roots can air prune. When it's not fully saturated, the roots will go to that rock material and they're kind of going to air prune. They'll stop there and not get too root bound. But they could, if they wanted to, make their way out of these side holes. And I want that to be a possibility. So we'll talk about that in a moment, but just keep that in mind, that those side holes are an opportunity for the plant to get access to more water and more nutrients. This is a blended soil. It's, some local soil. We have a silty clay loam. It's mixed with compost, our abundant biology compost. And it's also mixed with a little bit of perlite and vermiculite for aeration in the soil. I also blended a little bit of minerals in with this. It was a little damp when I blended it, so it's got some little ballies in it, but that's okay. I'll break those up. All right, so tomato is what we're after. It's a nice one. I think this is a Cherokee purple. So we've got our container, not topped all the way off, but pretty full. So we've got a rooting zone of about, 14 inches or so for this tomato. It's going to be plenty of rooting area for the tomato, and it's also going to be plenty of nutrition. So I'm going to dig that little hole as deep as the transplant is in its pot, a little inoculant. Get that right in there. So we've got our container topped with soil, or it's not completely topped off, but there's enough soil to keep this tomato happy. We've got a little bit of inoculant going on the root ball, We're going to dig it in, plant it as deep as it was in its nursery pot, tuck it all in there, press it down. Great. And then a little mulch material is nice right around the surface. We could use straw, we could use that oak leaf, we can use some of our freshly mowed combo dry and fresh grass material. Do keep in mind when you're using freshly mowed grass that it will mat up and it'll create like a mold scenario if it stays moist and matted. So that's why having half dry and half fresh is nice. So this container garden is an option for those that are very space limited. Say you don't have a place to put in a sheet mulched garden, but you do have just a little patch of grass. So, or just a little patio or a driveway where you could put a couple 5-gallon buckets out to grow some of your slicing tomatoes and a couple cucumbers, a couple basil plants, some rosemary, some thyme. Many plants will be very happy in a large container like this. All you have to do is set it up properly and then make sure it stays well watered and has plenty of nutrition and sunlight. We talked about the sunlight orienting your garden. You want to make sure that you're placing this, especially for something like a tomato or a heat-loving plant, in a southern exposure so that you're getting full or at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight during the day. If you are space limited and you're putting this on your patio, if you're in an apartment, or if you're space limited and you're just setting this on your driveway, you have a landlord that doesn't want you to dig up the lawn or make any augmentations to the lawn, you'll use a drip tray. So this is really simple. Walmart. This is an oil pan you can get from your local Walmart, and it's deep enough and strong enough so that it'll last many seasons if well taken care of. Do keep in mind that plastic is going to degrade in sun. You know, the UV will degrade the plastic over time. This is a food grade bucket. This is not a food grade oil pan. But do keep in mind that if you are not using these during the off season, tuck them away in a protected space where sun is not constantly hitting it and it's not being exposed to the weather so that you can reuse it again. You don't have to dump the soil out. If you treat the soil well, if you're using your regenerative soil practices, if you've created a good soil blend, you've got a container that you can plant back into in the spring. This is your permanent garden. So if you are using the drip tray, it's just that simple. You've got the holes on the bottom, and now you've got a way to water either from the top when it's really young for the first couple of weeks. Your plants are going to be developing their root system. They're going to be, that root system is going to be occupying this soil zone, and so they're not going to be able to access water that's poured in through the bottom so easily. But after a couple of weeks, that root system is going to be down towards the bottom of the bucket, so you can start pouring water into the drip tray. But that's not the only way that you can utilize this. If you wanted to have access to the soil water, you can dig them in. And you'll need to kind of think it through. Is this something that is approved? You can check, if you are renting, check and make sure, but it's not very destructive. What you're doing is you're just cutting a profile of this bucket out of the soil, and you're going to go just deeper than the holes that you drilled in the bucket. So maybe 3 inches or so. So you've just traced your bucket, you've got an outline, and then you're going to go through and lift that soil out of that hole. Hit a stick there, and then you can place this bucket right into the soil, and then it has access to a lot of things. It has access to the soil, water table. It has access to the nutrients in that soil profile. It has access to the microbes. They can transfer in and out of that bucket. The roots will grow out of that bucket a little bit, and that's okay. Some plants, like rosemary or thyme or some more perennial woody plants, you can plant them in the bucket, and then in the winter, you remove the bucket and take it indoors. And you've got a long-lived plant. Take it back out in the spring, do the same thing. So the idea, we're not perfect here, the idea is to be able to nestle this bucket right into the soil. Make sure that your water intake holes or outflow holes are submerged below the soil surface. Cut it nicely, make it flat so that there's not an air pocket below the bucket. And when you get it settled in, use a little bit of soil to backfill it right around the edge. And you've got a place where it's safe for the roots to emerge out of those holes. They won't air prune, but they'll get access to the soil's multiple benefits. So yeah, that's a great way to have a container garden that is small disturbance area, but has access to the soil profile. All right, that's container gardening.